I prank called a radio station pretending to be from the FCC, scaring them into silence for a cruel prank they pulled on a woman. I am uncertain whether this story is appropriate for this forum. As I was not the individual actually harmed, my act of revenge was motivated by a situation involving someone I have never encountered. And I truly do not know if they gained any personal satisfaction from it. What I can confirm is the impact it had on the wrongdoer and that it provided me with a sense of fulfillment, so I will leave it to the audience to form their own opinions. Like many of my narratives, this one occurs in the distant past, prior to the widespread use of cell phones and the advent of universal caller identification, in an era when dinosaurs likely roamed the planet. At least, it was the 1980s. These contextual details are quite significant for the story. Our narrative unfolds in a major West Coast city famous for a large orange bridge and scrumptious sourdough bread. I had been residing in the city for several months, performing temporary duties for my company, and was getting ready for work on the relevant day. As was my routine, I was dressing while listening to a morning radio show on a local station. The disc jockeys of this station had recently begun a segment called the Monday Morning Wake-Up Call, where, on the first day of the week, they would place a prank call live on air to a victim chosen from suggestions submitted by the listening audience. Engaging in such pranks was quite controversial among radio professionals at that time. I had been a radio disc jockey in my hometown for a number of years, and there are specific regulations that must be observed. One of the most significant rules is that you cannot broadcast a false or misleading transmission, such as declaring an emergency or issuing a distress signal. Violating this rule is a federal offense. You risk losing your broadcasting license, incurring fines, or even facing jail time. It is a serious violation. The debate regarding this issue had already been settled, but at the moment of this incident, prank calls on air were considered a gray area. There were individuals who strongly believed it constituted a false transmission, and some stations declined to participate. The discussion on this topic was still quite active when this event took place. That particular day was a Monday, and the target of the prank had been nominated by her spouse. They had suffered a power outage at home earlier that week, and the husband's suggestion was for the station to call his wife, pretended to be from the utility company, and inform her that the outage was somehow their fault, thereby requiring them to cover the expenses. The station personnel found the idea amusing, and they proceeded to place a call to the woman at her workplace, a local bank. She answered, and the prank commenced. "Hello, is this Mrs. Victim? I am John Doe from Area Power Company. Do you recall having a power failure earlier this week? Well, it was caused by a blown transformer on your block, and we have concluded that the issue lies within the wiring of your house. We may have to disconnect your power until it is repaired. Additionally, you will be billed for the transformer. The total cost is X $1,000. Would you prefer we add that to your utility bill, or would you prefer to make alternative arrangements for payment?" As one can imagine, the woman was initially taken aback, then frightened. As she requested more details, struggling to comprehend that they were indeed going to have to pay thousands of dollars, she became increasingly agitated. This fueled the radio staff's enthusiasm. The caller intensified the pressure on her, eventually informing her that her power would likely be shut off until payment was received, and that she might even face a lawsuit. After several minutes, she abruptly hung up in tears. He called her back, and upon hearing his voice, she hung up once more, crying even more intensely. This time, the caller waited for a minute before attempting to call again. A different lady answered, a colleague, and he inquired about speaking to Mrs. Victim. When the coworker asked for his name, he replied, "This is her husband, distinctive first name." The coworker cursed at him, called him a liar, and hung up. The radio studio erupted with laughter. The jocks found it uproarious. They took calls from listeners who were all giggling and discussing what a fantastic prank it was. Eventually, they managed to get the husband on the line, the one with the distinctive name, and he was also laughing and joking that he would undoubtedly be sleeping on the couch that evening. He congratulated the radio staff for their impressive job at tormenting his wife. The hosts promised their audience that, due to the prank's humor, they would certainly replay the entire recorded call at noon, urging listeners to be sure to tune in and notify your friends. Meanwhile, As I listened in my small apartment, I felt a surge of anger. I was still relatively newly married and could not fathom carrying out such a thing to my wife. Despite the radio hosts and audience laughing, all I could think about was that, just a few miles away, a young woman was in the restroom in tears, likely with coworkers trying to console her. What added to my distress was that the person who orchestrated this situation was the one individual who should have been there to support her husband. My anger quickly transformed into determination, and that determination sparked a plan. I grabbed the city phone directory, keeping in mind it was the 1980s, and looked up 2 phone numbers. I dialed the first one. You might remember that I mentioned I had been a radio disc jockey myself. It was a small station that operated from dawn until dusk, but I understood how such stations functioned. I knew what they appreciated, and more importantly, I understood what they did not appreciate. I had also performed extensive voiceover work and could adopt a highly professional tone. The phone rang and was answered. "You've reached K, Radio Jerk?" I launched my mission. Me in a professional tone. "Yes, this is George Smith. I chose a more credible name from the City Office of the Federal Communications Commission. I have been receiving some concerning calls about your morning radio program, and I need to speak with your program director to discuss it." Radio guy 1, stammering, "Ooh, he's not, here right now. Let me get you someone else." I was placed on hold. After a few moments, Radio guy 2 also stammering, "Hi, hello. Ooh, this is Radio guy 2. You're from the FCC. Me, "Yes, this is George Smith from the City Office of the Federal Communications Commission. As I informed your coworker, I have been receiving some concerning calls about your morning show, and I need to speak with your program director to address it." Radio guy 2, short silence, "Ooh, he hasn't arrived yet. He'll be here at, 9 o'clock. Me, "All right, well, I can start with your station manager since he should also be included in this discussion." Radio guy 2 breathing rapidly, starting to lose his composure. "Oh wow, he gets in at 9 too. I can have him call you," he somewhat pleaded. Me releasing what I hoped sounded like a bureaucratic sigh. "Very well, I will anticipate a call from him at 9. I will need to speak to your station manager, your programming director, and quite likely your on-air personnel from this morning. I will also require access to your station logs." Radio guy 2, "Oh yes, sir. I will ensure he contacts you promptly." Me, "Very well, I will be awaiting his call. Here is my number." At this point, I provided Radio guy 2 with the second number I had looked up in the phone book, which was the main line for the City Office of the Federal Communications Commission. He expressed his thanks and assurances of a forthcoming call, and we ended the conversation. I turned my attention back to the radio. "Jerk disc jockey, ooh, the FCC is calling. Well, they cannot take any action against me. I've completed a year of pre-law in college and blah blah blah." He persisted in his defiant rant for a few more minutes before transitioning to commercial. I continued listening. They ceased discussing the prank call. They stopped receiving calls from listeners. They stopped communicating with the husband. They began to play music. A lot of music. I listened throughout the remainder of the day. They did not mention the incident again, nor did they replay it at noon. In fact, throughout the entire week, I heard no reference to it at all. I was somewhat taken aback. I had expected them to pause discussions on the topic for a short while but not entirely abandon it. It was only later that I understood the reason for their silence. I had frightened them. In my attempt to enact a small measure of retribution for the tears of that woman I had never met, I had scared them. More importantly, I had embarrassed them, and Jerk Disc Jockey had contributed to that embarrassment. Once he went public with his bravado against the purported call from the authorities, their listeners were aware of the interruption and also perceived the ensuing silence. They felt embarrassed because I had effectively turned the tables on them in the same manner they had done to her, and they were reluctant to acknowledge it. I have chosen to keep the distinctive name of the husband confidential, as I have always hoped to meet that unfortunate woman, and that name would serve as my means of recognizing her. I doubt she remains married to that man, but I would like to inform her that on that occasion, in that place, someone was on her side. Story 2. I received a call from Bill after he slit his throat. He missed his carotid by a millimeter. His bullies got dishonorably discharged. This account may not be entirely my personal revenge, but I witnessed some retribution closely and took satisfaction from it, while also being involved to a minor extent. The context is crucial, so please bear with me as I elaborate. Content warning for self-harm. I served in the Navy and was assigned to the submarine base in Connecticut. During boot camp, I made a friend who joined the same training class for our school Navy job training. Let's refer to that friend as Bill. Bill was not particularly athletic. He was shorter, somewhat overweight, and wore glasses. Nevertheless, he possessed a sharp intellect, and as a sonar technician, he had the potential to excel. I admired his practical perspective on various matters, which I greatly appreciated in a friend. I believed he would have flourished if he had made it to the fleet. While attending class, we had a couple of particularly tough petty officers. They somehow convinced themselves they were elite soldiers, despite the fact that the work we did in that area was highly intellectual. People were selected for that role based on their mathematical and computer skills, rather than their physical strength. Regardless, these officers were obsessed with fitness and spent a significant amount of time working out. We engaged in physical training 3 times weekly, and while most of us kept up, Bill frequently struggled during runs and did not meet the unreasonable standards set by these 2 individuals. To clarify, Bill did meet the minimum fitness requirements. He just did not push himself to the extreme that these officers expected. As an aside for fellow Navy veterans, he earned the McPon coin for his dedication during physical training on the day that the McPon visited. Consequently, they would relentlessly insult and demean Bill. They labeled him as lazy, overweight, and various other derogatory terms. They even went as far as to tell him he should take his own life. Their harassment continued, despite the fact that he consistently met his assessment requirements. Eventually, Bill overexerted himself and sustained a knee injury. He informed the petty officers of his condition and mentioned that a doctor on base had examined him. The doctor had placed him on light duty to allow for recovery, and Bill had the necessary documentation to support this. They chose to ignore his medical situation and pressured him with threats of dismissal if he failed to participate in the workouts. As a result, Bill continued to push himself, aggravating his injury, while his mental health deteriorated throughout this time. During my Navy service, mental health services were nearly non-existent. The only person available for such conversations was the chaplain. For those unfamiliar, the chaplain is a religious leader, typically a pastor, priest, or rabbi who serves as a commissioned officer. The chaplain assigned to us was a kind, gentle woman, yet held the rank of captain, a high-level officer. Bill scheduled a meeting with the chaplain to discuss his struggles. When he notified the petty officers that he would be absent for the chaplain meeting the following day, they lashed out at him even further. They insulted him, calling him weak, worthless, and unfit for military service, among other things. They convinced Bill that he was being cowardly and that the chaplain would not understand his concerns, persuading him that nobody cared. They threatened to make his life even more difficult if he did not attend the next day's class. As a result, he canceled his appointment. Unfortunately, that night, his girlfriend decided to end their relationship, which compounded his distress. She was not deserving of his time or resources, but he was unable to recognize that. I awoke at 3:00 a.m. to a call from Bill. I could not hear him and repeatedly asked, "Bill, are you there? Are you okay?" This was not the first occasion I received a drunken call from a friend after a tough day, as sailors sometimes turn to alcohol for comfort. Eventually, believing it was a mistake, I ended the call and returned to sleep. I still regret that choice. The following day was chaotic. A few friends and I received calls from Bill's ex-girlfriend informing us that he was hospitalized after attempting to take his own life. It turned out several of us received that 3:00 a.m. call. However, Bill had been unable to speak clearly at the time due to significant blood loss. We completed our obligations on base and rushed to the hospital. Upon arrival, we encountered the chaplain as she was exiting the building. She briefly reassured us that Bill would be all right and that she would not forget what had happened. I have rarely seen such a vivid expression of pure, unrestrained fury. Her unexpected reaction shocked us, given her small stature and gentle demeanor. Yet her eyes betrayed her desire for justice, indicating that she wanted someone to answer for what had transpired, and we were all aware she held the authority to make that happen. We visited Bill, who could barely communicate but shared the events leading to his injury, his thoughts at that moment, and expressed relief that he had survived. Remarkably, it was so cold that the blood had clotted on the surface of his neck, forming a sort of barrier that ensured he remained alive long enough for emergency services to reach him and transport him to the hospital. The doctor later revealed that he had narrowly missed severing his carotid artery by roughly a millimeter. A week passed without further information until we were summoned by the chief of the training command, the superior officer overseeing those petty officers. He expressed concern for our well-being and sought to determine if there were any other issues with these officers that he was unaware of. I informed him about an incident in which he chastised me a few months prior. I explained that I had been unjustly positioned by those officers who had misled him. My friends also shared their experiences, highlighting numerous instances of these officers' generally dishonest conduct. Ultimately, I don't believe it mattered. Their fate seemed predetermined, and we were being asked to provide additional evidence against them. The next day, they were conspicuously absent, and we were introduced to new instructors who would permanently take over our training. After class, I decided to check in with the chaplain regarding what had transpired. She confided in me that she had never been more appalled by the behavior of a sailor than by those two officers who dissuaded someone from seeking her assistance. She expressed regret, feeling that she had missed the opportunity to help Bill before his tragic attempt. In her view, those two officers had precipitated and enabled Bill's crisis. Now, onto the retribution. The chaplain relayed that she approached the admiral overseeing the entire base and demanded their immediate discharge. He granted her request. Both petty officers were processed out with non-honorable discharges. While I cannot recall the specific charges cited, I am aware that the Navy has a way of framing documentation when they desire a particular outcome, especially at that high-ranking level. In summary, they received no Veterans Affairs benefits, were expelled from their base housing, and likely could only find employment in low-paying jobs, like at a gas station or other informal work. I also learned from someone else who had been discharged that the Navy covers only a single bus ticket home, not for family or personal belongings. With a discharge of that nature, no company with Department of Defense contracts is permitted to hire you. This restriction extends to fast food chains, like McDonald's, which operate on military bases. Other franchises such as Taco Bell and Subway would also be unable to employ them. I have no idea where these individuals ended up or what became of them, but it is reasonable to assume their lives were irrevocably altered. One of them had approximately 18 years of service, meaning he was just 2 years away from retirement when it all unraveled. The other had about 12 years, so he also lost a significant amount. Wherever they might be now, I would be shocked to learn they are earning more than minimum wage. As for Bill, he made a complete recovery and received a full medical discharge, which is classified as an honorable discharge, affording him E5 pay for his lifetime, full benefits, and a referral to a counselor in his home state upon his return. All these costs were covered by the Navy. Though we lost contact over the years, I did see on Facebook that he turned his life around, became a police officer, and got married. Edit to clarify for those who have noted it, their discharges were technically other than honorable, but I avoided the complexities to prevent having to elaborate or for others to look it up. We often use dishonorable informally for other than honorable or bad conduct discharge, as they all indicate an unfavorable separation that dramatically impacts one's life. However, they did not face court-martial or any time in the brig. I did hear they were pushed to an administrative separation board and lost. I also noticed someone mentioned Bill wouldn't receive 100% medical coverage for his neck injury. That's also correct. However, his records were categorized under his knee injury, which was essentially a bone-on-bone condition. It appears they chose to file his case favorably rather than label it a mental health discharge. Story 3. I lost $350 to a scammer posing as my boss. Years later, I exposed him, leading to his conviction and a spine-breaking ATV crash. This occurred a few years ago, and I feel prepared to share the experience with you all. Backstory: I was beginning my career in the security industry and had limited practical experience. In my country, private security is heavily regulated, important for later, and licenses are required at nearly every step. I was enrolled in a local security school, from which I would eventually graduate as a security supervisor. While studying, I decided to apply for a position at a small private security firm to earn some extra money. The company primarily handled sporting events and concerts. I was one of almost 100 employees and quickly learned that the connections established in this field are paramount. The working environment was positive, and I was part of a fantastic team responsible for conducting security checks and managing traffic near the event venues. Lacking the funds for professional equipment, I had to rely on used materials, workwear, vests, second-rate pepper spray, etc. This is where our deceptive, pathological liar enters the picture. Let's call him Sammy. Sammy was somewhat unusual, but had a social disposition and was, at the time, perceived as pleasant by many in our company. I had made some friends who were in similar situations, and Sammy soon approached us, claiming he could sell new sets of vests and equipment at a reasonable price. We were foolish to trust him, but we finalized the deal since the security industry is quite small, and negative word travels quickly, so we believed there was no risk involved. He received the money upfront and promised delivery on a specified date a few weeks later. Soon after, he contacted me and inquired if I would be interested in working as a bouncer a few times the following week. I agreed, as I needed the money. He assured me that he would pay me in cash later that month. He also asked if I would be interested in working as security at the county fair, to which I readily agreed, as it was the easiest money one could earn. I fulfilled the bouncer assignments as planned and later attended the county fair, where other members of our company were present, with Sammy as the head of security. There, I inquired about the equipment that my friends and I had paid for. He responded that it would arrive the following week. Weeks went by. No payment from the fair and no equipment. He transferred me money for the bouncer gigs, but it was only half of what was promised. When I questioned him about this, he said there was a fee since he was the middleman. He also claimed that the county fair was facing financial difficulties, so he couldn't pay. The following week, he provided another excuse. In the normal course of work at sporting events, colleagues who had worked with me at the fair had also not been compensated, and they were beginning to suspect that something was amiss. I became increasingly concerned, so I contacted the county fair organizers directly, despite Sammy specifically advising me against it, as he was supposedly addressing the situation, to inquire about what was happening. They were astonished. They informed me that the responsibility for security at the county fair had been assigned to a volunteer organization comprised of retired and former security officers working for the community without pay. Sammy was volunteering for that organization. He had been tasked with recruiting volunteers for the fair and had assumed that promising payment would make it easier to secure their participation. I had lost over $350 due to his deceit within a week, and I desperately needed that money. I contacted the organization regarding the matter, and they dismissed Sammy from his responsibilities on the spot and banned him from all events that they were involved in. The security company I worked for also operated a small courier and hauling business on the side. I applied for a position there since I had a truck driving license, and my boss understood my urgent need for employment. I had not seen Sammy around, as he was supposedly on leave from security gigs, and no one knew his whereabouts. People were quite upset with him after hearing from me what he had done. After 2 weeks on the trucking job, I was summoned to the office. It turned out that the previous day, I had executed my route entirely incorrectly, and the deliveries had also been delayed. I was terminated on the spot. Leaving the office, Sammy appeared out of nowhere in the hallway. He glared at me and smiled sinisterly, saying, "Oh, you lost your job. Well, that happens when you mess with the wrong people." I was taken aback and bewildered by the situation. Sammy walked into the office behind me and closed the door. Later that day, I discovered that he was responsible for managing the routes, delivery markings, and timings. He had been hired just a few weeks before I began that job. He got me fired. I resigned from my position at the security company as my boss sided with Sammy, even though he acknowledged that Sammy was, probably, responsible for my failure in that role. I couldn't approach the police since it was essentially his word against mine. I was infuriated and made a silent, firm vow that I would ruin Sammy's life, no matter the cost. Before long, I applied for a position at a larger security company that focused on supermarkets, malls, and other venues, and successfully secured the job. A few years later, I had established myself as a trustworthy and diligent security officer, so when there was a new hire, they were typically assigned to me for training and orientation. Enter Jay, who came to learn the fundamentals of the job. While I was instructing him, I also inquired about his background and experiences since we would be working closely together. Jay shared details about his life and mentioned that he was also working part-time at a security company called X, which had a name strikingly similar to a well-known local security firm, woman.I. I initially thought he had mispronounced the company name, as he was from a rural area and his dialect differed from mine. However, he insisted that he was indeed working for Company X. When I asked who his supervisor was, it turned out to be Sammy. I realized that my years of patience had finally paid off, as I knew precisely what Sammy had been up to. And now for the revenge. I explained to Jay everything that had transpired between Sammy and me. Jay was shocked, but acknowledged that he had also suspected that something was off about Sammy. As everything was bureaucratic in my country, public records were available for all security companies. Sammy's company was not a registered entity, which is a crime since he lacked a license. Jay informed me that Sammy had around 15 individuals working for him, and they maintained a private Facebook group where he operated as a job recruiter and managed the workers' wages. I realized the extent of his deception. He was deceiving them all into believing that he was handling their taxes and pension contributions, a responsibility of employers, when, in reality, he pocketed the money for himself and fabricated pay slips. I instructed Jay to gather all the evidence he could against Sammy. Jay captured photographs, screenshots, and collected statements from his coworkers. Before long, Sammy became aware of this and terminated Jay from his fraudulent company, threatening him with lawsuits and claiming that Jay would never secure employment without Sammy's approval, which was absolute nonsense. Jay had already found a position in the company where I was employed after I provided a good recommendation for him. I started piecing together the puzzle of Sammy's malfeasance for my revenge. First, I contacted his clients and business associates and presented them with irrefutable evidence. One by one, he began to lose his customers. Then, I reported him to the police for his tax evasion and phony security firm. At this stage, the local tax authority took a keen interest in Sammy's operations. Soon, I learned that he had disappeared entirely from public view. Not long after, I found out he had been convicted on multiple charges, required to pay substantial legal fees and fines, and had been placed on probation for roughly a year. He had to avoid public exposure as he had also fabricated his educational background and scammed numerous individuals. I began receiving messages on Facebook indicating that his story was spreading like wildfire. I learned that he could not find work anywhere, as word about his misdeeds had circulated on my country's largest private security-oriented Facebook page, which boasted more than 80% of all active security officers and bouncers as members. I felt immense satisfaction, yet somehow sensed that there was still more in store for Sammy. Last year, I learned that he was leading an ATV quad bike organization and was once again collecting fees from individuals wishing to partake in ATV safaris, despite having a notorious reputation as a poor driver. A gut feeling urged me not to intervene. Would you believe it? One day, while guiding an ATV safari, Sammy crashed, resulting in a broken spine. I felt no sympathy for him at all, knowing precisely what kind of scoundrel he truly was. A few months later, I saw him. He was using a walking stick and limping severely. Now, my vengeance was complete, aided slightly by our fair friend Karma. Story 4. Tapped by a Karen, headphones ripped off. Panic set in as I shouted in German, but now she's my wife. OMG. My wife reminded me of this story recently, back when I was on a service trip to the United States approximately 10 to 15 years ago, during which I encountered a Karen. I must confess, I am uncertain whether this belongs here or if I should post it in the r entitled thread, but I hope this is the right place. As I mentioned, I am a service technician. I hail from Germany and was on a field assignment with a colleague who also originates from Germany in Spartanburg, South Carolina. The service process was proceeding smoothly, just to let you know. Indeed, we were staying at a hotel, but the United States tends to be a bit pricey, and rather than waste our money dining out every single day, we considered it more prudent to prepare our own lunches. By sheer coincidence, there was one of those large grocery stores located conveniently between our hotel and the service site. Whenever we needed something, we could stop by after work and pick up what we required. And yes, we were in our work attire, so I can see why someone might confuse me for a store employee, but still. We were dressed in blue work trousers, safety shoes, and black t-shirts featuring our names printed in yellow, along with a large yellow E-Team logo accompanied by an electrical flash on the back. So you might understand why Karen became disoriented. This was our identification for the electrical department. That covers most of the background. Now onto the story. My colleague remained outside since I was the only one who needed something, so I grabbed a shopping cart, entered the store, and began my search, as I didn't want to keep my coworker waiting. I had my MP3 player with me, which was filling my ears with my favorite music. I had already gathered a good amount of what I needed, but due to my allergies, I always check the ingredients of everything. If I found any item that contained something I was allergic to, it went back on the shelf. I genuinely do not know why Karen might have assumed I was restocking the shelves. Nevertheless, I was in an aisle where bread was displayed, so I was examining the ingredients since the last loaf I bought contained far too much sugar for my liking. While I was inspecting the items, I felt a tap on my shoulder, accompanied by a noise that thankfully was drowned out by my headphones. I turned around to face her, likely wearing a surprised expression since it was my first encounter of this nature. I apologized and stepped aside a little, thinking I was obstructing her path. However, she did it again, tapping my shoulder and making a noise I still couldn't hear. At that point, growing increasingly irritated, I moved aside once more. Karen was undeterred and yanked off my headphones, damaging them in the process, and shouted in my ear, "Excuse me." I was completely taken aback. I couldn't respond at all, and at that moment, all of my English knowledge seemed to evaporate. I was shocked but tried to pick up my damaged headphones and escape from this person. She was shouting something I couldn't remember, as I momentarily blanked out. All I wanted was to get away, abandoning the cart behind me. I didn't collect all my belongings and, in my panic, didn't care about the headphones. But Karen seized me, preventing my escape. I should mention that I weigh around 60 kilograms at a height of 178 centimeters. I am not athletic. I am more of a typical tech enthusiast, and although I am now 40 years old, I still remain quite slim. I couldn't match the strength of that woman at all. Is that embarrassing? Yes, it certainly is. My mind came back online as she screamed at me, "Don't you dare run away, you lazy bastard. You will assist me, or I will have your job." In response, I accidentally replied to her in German. I will translate it as accurately as possible, as I sometimes use German slang, which is quite difficult to convey, so please bear with me. Was wollen sei von mir, lassen sei mich gehen. Translation: What do you want from me? Let me go. Karen appeared, I don't know, perhaps appalled, because I was not speaking English to her. "We are in America, America. Stop speaking nonsense and help me. Otherwise, you'll face the consequences and lose your job." She shoved me into a corner and continued shouting at me. Once again, I couldn't grasp it all as I had zoned out. She kept going on about being lazy and getting fired, but I couldn't recall every word. However, you know what they say about an animal cornered, so I found my courage in that moment. I shouted back at her with all the strength I had left, "Schnauz." Translation: Shut up. Ich glaub is hacked. Was ist ihr Verskasins problem, Verpassen sei sich indlich und lassen mich in Ruhe. Translation: This is absolutely ridiculous. What is your fing problem? Get the F out of here and leave me alone. Karen attempted to start over, speak English, but I interrupted her. Ich sagt Schnauz, und jetzt sei zu, dass du Land juenst. Translation: I said shut up, and now make sure to get some distance from me. Karen appeared taken aback for a moment, and I ensured I escaped the corner. Unfortunately, the ordeal did not conclude there. Karen eventually located a manager and followed me to the exit. I desperately wanted to leave the store as quickly as possible, but I was unfortunate. I didn't know the store layout very well. Just as I intended to exit, they caught up to me, and security restrained me. She was saying something I could not comprehend, and the manager, a very kind lady, was speaking to me in English, of course. I had completely zoned out and felt incredibly fearful, worrying that someone might shoot me since it's the United States. Gun violence is everywhere, that's what my mind was thinking. I kept repeating the only English words I could manage, don't shoot me, over and over like a broken record. I assume they realized I was in no state of normal behavior, panicked about being shot, so they eventually called 911. The kind manager stayed with me the entire time, even attempting to comfort me. The fear was genuine, and I continued speaking in German. To my surprise, the kind manager caught on and began speaking to me in German as well. Later, I discovered she had German ancestry, so she could speak some of the language. It wasn't perfect, but I appreciated it. Shortly after the chaos, my colleague entered, clearly concerned. With the assistance of the medics, the lovely manager, and my coworker, I managed to calm down. That was the most terrifying encounter I have ever experienced, and to be frank, I thought I would never return to the United States again. Now, for the aftermath. I didn't grasp many details since I had zoned out extensively, but from what people told me, Karen faced charges. However, since we were from Europe, I am uncertain what the charges were, and to be honest, I do not care. My colleague and I lost a day of work, which bothers me the most. However, on the other hand, I still had about 2 weeks of service obligations remaining, and although I wished to leave the United States as soon as possible, I completed my duty. Fortunately, I encountered that lovely manager at a bar, and we began discussing the incident. She informed me that Karen had been banned from the store and mentioned the potential charges Karen might face. As I said, I didn't care. I was just relieved to have survived. Nonetheless, that wonderful manager and I stayed in touch, and guess what? She became my wife and now lives with me in Germany. Her family is wonderful, and I always look forward to seeing them during Thanksgiving. So, from the most horrifying moment of my life, a kind of, I don't work here story, I ended up finding the love of my life. Thanks to Karen, but honestly, just go away. I apologize for not being able to provide more specifics about Karen's fate since, well, it didn't matter to me, but I hope you enjoyed the story and it qualifies for a, I don't work here, lady. Even though it's slightly different.